Picture this. You're in ancient Rome. You walk into the market with the exact same handful of coins you used last month. Last month, that got you bread, oil, and a decent cut of meat. This month, you're leaving with the bread and maybe half the oil. Nobody stole your money and nobody robbed you on the way there. So what happened? You just met inflation. And here's the wild part. Ancient people didn't have economists. They didn't have the Federal Reserve. They didn't have CNBC. And they didn't have some guy in a suit explaining quantitative easing while you nod along pretending you understand. And yet, somehow, across multiple ancient civilizations, thousands of years before the word inflation was even invented, people absolutely noticed prices creeping upward. They wrote about it, they complained about it, and some of them even tried to fix it. Badly. So today we're asking the question nobody asks. How did ancient people figure out inflation was happening without a single spreadsheet, without a single economics degree, and honestly, sometimes faster than modern governments figure it out? Let's start with the obvious clue. Money getting smaller. Not smaller in your pocket, but smaller in actual size. In ancient Rome, coins weren't just symbols of value, they were the value. A silver coin called the denarius was, at least originally, mostly silver. Real, physical, weighable silver. And for a while, that worked beautifully. But by the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire had a spending problem. Wars, bureaucracy, and bribing your own army to not revolt. All of that costs money. And when you don't have enough money, apparently the ancient solution was exactly what you'd guess. Just make more. Except you can't just print more silver. So Roman officials did something sneakier. They kept minting denarii that looked the same, felt the same, and were still called the same thing, but quietly reduced the actual silver content. By the year 268 AD, the silver denarius was somewhere around 0.5% silver. 0.5%. It was basically a shiny coin-shaped rumor of silver. And here's where it gets interesting. Roman citizens noticed. Merchants noticed first, because merchants always notice money problems first. It's basically their whole job. They started demanding more coins for the same goods because they knew the coins in their hand were worth less metal than the ones from 10 years earlier. Prices spiked. Historians estimate some prices in the late Roman Empire rose by a jaw-dropping amount within just a few decades. Not gradually, but rapidly. People were living through what we would now casually call a currency collapse, except they didn't have that phrase. They just called it, everything is expensive now and nobody knows why. Then Emperor Diocletian did something almost hilarious in hindsight. In 301 AD, he issued something historians now call the Edict on Maximum Prices. Basically, it was an imperial decree that said, legally, you are not allowed to charge more than this specific price for this specific item. Wheat, wine, shoes, even hairdressing services, all had a government-mandated ceiling. Diocletian's official reasoning, straight from the edict itself, blamed the unlimited and frenzied avarice of merchants, which is a very dramatic way of saying, prices are going up and it's definitely not our fault for wrecking the currency. Spoiler, the price caps didn't work. Merchants simply stopped selling goods at a loss, black markets exploded, and shortages got worse. Within a few years, the edict quietly collapsed under its own weight. Ancient people, it turns out, invented price controls, and immediately discovered why they don't work. We've been relearning that lesson every century since. But Rome wasn't the only place noticing prices creep. Let's go even further back. Ancient Egypt kept incredibly detailed records, and some of the most fascinating ones are grain prices, tracked over centuries by temple scribes and administrators. Grain wasn't just food in Egypt, it was basically currency itself, used to pay workers and settle debts, and Egyptologists studying these records have found periods where grain prices spiked dramatically, sometimes tied to bad harvests, sometimes tied to political instability, and sometimes tied to the value of silver shifting relative to grain. The scribes didn't have a word for inflation, but they absolutely tracked the pattern. When grain prices rose, workers rioted. There are documented labor strikes in ancient Egypt, some of the earliest strikes in recorded history, directly triggered by workers not being paid enough to survive because prices had outpaced their wages. Let that sit for a second. The first labor strikes in human history may have been, at their core, an inflation protest. Now here's a clue that almost nobody talks about. Debasement wasn't limited to Rome. Ancient China dealt with something similar, but with a twist: paper money. China was actually the first civilization to introduce paper currency, centuries before Europe even considered it, and almost immediately the same problem showed up. Governments realized that printing more paper money was a lot easier than mining more silver. During the Song and later Yuan dynasties, excessive printing led to serious price increases. Merchants adjusted. They demanded more paper notes for the same goods, or refused paper entirely and reverted to bartering with silk, grain, or metal coins they actually trusted. Chinese officials at the time wrote directly about the problem, describing money that had become, in their words, essentially worthless paper. That's not modern economic language. That's someone in the 13th century describing hyperinflation in real time. So how did people across completely unconnected civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries, all figure out the same basic truth? Simple. They didn't need theory. They had lived experience. If your coin used to buy a loaf of bread and now it buys half a loaf, you don't need a PhD to notice. You need a stomach. Inflation, at its core, isn't an abstract concept. It's a deeply personal, deeply physical experience. Less food, less trust, less security. Ancient people understood inflation the same way we understand it today, through their bodies, their meals, and their bargaining at the market stall. And there's something almost poetic about that. We like to imagine ancient people as primitive, unaware, stumbling through history without understanding the forces shaping their lives. But debasement, price spikes, worthless currency, government denial, none of that is new. We didn't invent economic collapse, we just gave it fancier names and put it on the news instead of a stone tablet. So next time you complain about grocery prices, know this. Somewhere, 2,000 years ago, a Roman citizen was standing in a marketplace doing the exact same thing, staring at their coins, staring at the bread, and quietly doing the math that never, ever changes. Less value, same price, same confusion, same anger. Some things really never change. We just got better at hiding it behind spreadsheets.